Hi. Thank you so much for all the work that you guys do. We really do need to fix our government. The first question, so I have two questions, but I guess I'll probably have to go in the back of the line again. The first question is about the voucher system. So if we have a voucher system, that means that all candidates have, dollars that they got, they can redeem them. They say, okay, we have these, we can speak for this amount of time to the public. But if the media corporations aren't also limited, then whatever the big corporations who have so much power over the media corporations, then they will have an unfair advantage on the elections. So whoever they think is awesome, they will push, and they'll say everyone else sucks. So if you've got, like, for example, Howard Dean, I loved Howard Dean, and the media corporations for 4 days said 633 times why he sucked. Now, that wasn't a campaign contribution or anything like that.
Excellent.
If the voucher system is going to be fair for everyone, then the media corporations would have to either be silenced or something.
Yeah.
So that's
the question, as I understand it, is about a system where every taxpayer would have a tax credit of $50, $100 more, and then candidates who opt into that, to receiving that and only that contribution, would then be able to reduce the unfair nature of contributions by seeking contributions from the masses rather than from the select few. But what about the media? What about their unfair bias?
So it's a great point. It points to the fact that, there isn't just one problem with American democracy. There's a whole series of problems with American democracy. But I think it's really important to distinguish between the problems that are caused by the way campaigns raise their money and the problems that might be caused by the way that money gets spent. I'm not saying there's not a problem with both of them, but I think they're different kinds of problems. And so what the voucher system is trying to focus on is the perversion that gets produced by the way in which campaigns raise their money. It's not trying to solve the problem about how the money gets spent or what other influences there are in the political system. And the reason I think it's important to solve the raising of money first is that then will make it easier to solve the other problems. So the question isn't whether there's, which is the most important problem. The question is the sequence of changes that makes it possible to address as many as we can. And the reason I think this difference is really critical is if you had to raise your money in $50 or $100 chunks, that means you would have to appeal to a much wider swath of Americans to be able to raise your money, as opposed to the current system where you're needing to appeal to a tiny, tiny fraction of the 1%. So that change in the way that we're funding elections would have a consequence of just changing the sensibilities of the candidates as they actually raise this money. And in states like Connecticut, which adopted not the voucher system but a small dollar funded system, what they found was that 78% of the elected representatives, the people who won, opted into that small dollar system in the first year, meaning they spent their time talking to voters rather than spending their time talking to funders. So that's trying to address that problem first. And the advantage of taking that problem on first is that you can fix that without amending the Constitution. If you want to address the problem you're talking about, you would have to, according to the Supreme Court, change the Constitution. So if we need to do that, we need to first get a Congress that's open to doing that. And I think the first step to getting that is to get a Congress who would pass a change in the way campaigns are funded.
Let me add one other thing to that, which is also not a solution to the very real problem that you raise, but which is relevant in this way, and that is that we know that the more money a candidate raises for their campaign, the better they're likely to do. But we also know that the less well-funded candidate will often win an election. And so it's not always about who has the most money. And one of the problems is that the people who support the kinds of issues that we're talking about now, these kinds of reforms, it's not that they have less money than their opponents, it's that they have essentially no money. And if we can at least get people above a threshold to be a viable candidate, then even if there are other problems, like third parties in the media that aren't constrained by a voucher system, nevertheless, it can get us a long way, at least toward making more of those kinds of candidates viable.
Excellent. Let's go to the internet for a second, where Hannah Chan 7 asks, while removing big money is important, how do you solve the problem of low minority turnout? The idea of equity in addition to access.
Yeah, so my view is, people are often critical of people for not voting. That's actually better than anything
That's
I would
great.
be
We get the
singing
call
and
to
saying,
prayer
so-
going on someone's phone. The audience, I promise it's not mine.
But if you look at Martin's data, you might say, why should they vote? What would the reason be to vote? Because what's the payoff for participating? Instead, the cynical view that it doesn't matter, not because one vote just doesn't statistically turn out to matter much, but just even if you believe that there's a reason to be voting because you're a citizen, you still can see the system is not responding to you as the average voter. So I think the first step is to give people a good reason to want to vote, to create a system where what the average voter votes for actually gets reflected in what our government does, to see that line move from being flat to an incline. And if you did that and then people didn't vote, we'd have a moral reason to say to them, you're a schmuck. You ought to be out there voting. But right now, I don't feel I have any entitlement to tell them to do something that's a total waste of their time in the given structure of our system right now.
Unless you're in Cambridge, in which case you should register immediately. I do want to remind you that the Twitter hashtag is CitizenUp, and that the handles you guys go by are Lessig, @Lessig, and not on Twitter. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to have to lobby him. We got a round of applause. And I'm @NadimTron, for what that's worth. Can we go to this mic?
Thank you. My name is Jonathan Simon, and I am Executive Director of Election Defense Alliance. And I've recently written a book called Code Red, Computerized Election Theft in the New American Century. And so I'm quite persuaded that there are plenty of things wrong with democracy, some of which you've enumerated. But my question is, can we have a serious discussion about reforming democracy? And I see this all the time. There are many such discussions, while giving a full faith-based pass to the vote counting system itself. We are willing to accept the results of elections where the vote count has been computerized and entirely unobservable. And I would maintain as a statement that unless we have observable vote counting, that our elections a priori lack legitimacy, any more than if you gave your votes to a man who went behind a curtain, came out and told you who won. But yet that is not getting addressed as a fundamental issue, and I would say that if you correct all the other things that are wrong with democracy, but you allow the cynics the direct method of manipulating the vote count, and studies have shown that it is very vulnerable to that, whether it's happened or not is another issue, but leaving aside any proofs of fraud, that if you have a system that's that vulnerable and not observable and you fix everything else, you're still in a pickle. What are we going to do about that?
Well, I don't disagree that that's another critical problem that has to be solved. But I would put it in the following perspective. There's only about 15% of congressional seats that are actually contested in any serious way, which means only about 15% where, exactly who's voting for whom and getting the numbers right is really going to matter one way or the other. That's a large number, but it's still not 100%. But in my way of understanding the current democracy, in about 100% of the cases, candidates are exposing themselves to the influence of this tiny, tiny fraction of the 1% because they're all taxed with the obligation to raise money. So that's why I think we've got to think about, again, the sequence of reform that makes other reform possible. And I think if we got to a Congress that wasn't so captured by this tiny 1%, it would be easier for that Congress to also address the problem which I think you've rightly pointed to, which is another critical feature that is a flaw inside of our democracy.
May I respond to that by just saying that I would be very happy if I agreed with you that that was the case. I don't think it's possible to throw the bums out if the bums are seated via election fraud, and if their colleagues are so content with being in office that they don't want to do anything about election fraud, because after all, whether they cheated or not, they're sitting in Washington or they're sitting in the state houses. And I agree with you about the 15%, but I have to say that in 2010, the watershed election of our time, 128 seats in the House were lost to the right wing. And whatever percentage that is of the seats that were competitive, that was a boatload of seats. And that is what's given us this Congress. And if you go into this...
Sorry, can I just jump in here? I think we need to go to the other side in a moment, but I appreciate your comments, and I think they're all on point. Thank you. Personally think that, not speaking on behalf of...
Thank you.
So that was an extraordinary talk, and this is an extraordinary plan. But I'd like to make a claim that there's something actually more important that had happened by 2016 than saving our democracy, and that is not only saving our democracy, but saving our civilization, and saving our children's lives and billions of lives, and our ability to feed ourselves. And people who know science are probably clapping because they know that I'm talking about climate disruption. And when we elect a Congress in 2016 that's going to save democracy, I would argue that it's more important that that Congress also save civilization by pricing carbon and finding a way to have a rational energy policy.
Ask you to get to the question.
That's the question. So can we, in parallel to electing a Congress that's going to reform our democracy, very ambitious, but more importantly, elect a Congress that's going to price carbon?
Look, when I first got into this issue, it was the recognition, as Aaron was trying to get me to see, that on the issues I was working on then, we weren't getting any progress till we changed the way campaigns are funded. But at the same time, a very close friend of mine was making Al Gore's movie, and I was following Gore around, watching Gore, and it hit me. You know, it's not rocket science. It should have been obvious before that it wasn't just the esoteric question about whether copyright terms should be life plus 70 or life plus 50 or 28 years. It was what I then believe, and still believe, the most fundamental problem. The way in which oil and carbon is used in our economy and therefore destroying our planet. I agree with you. It's from my perspective, the most fundamental problem. And so when I look at people like Tom Steyer spending $100 million to try to get a Congress that would pass this kind of change, I say more power to you, Tom. But I want to also say, Tom, you're up against an industry that makes $100 billion in profit every year. $100 billion in profit. So you spend $100 million against $100 billion, and even if Marty's right that you don't have to be at parity or above to win, I don't think you're going to win. So I'm not denying the importance of what you're saying. I'm not saying my issue is the most important. I'm saying my issue is the first issue, not the most important issue. You have to solve this issue before you solve the others. And I wish we had solved this issue 20 years ago. Because if we had, I'm absolutely convinced, we, like the rest of the sane parts of the world, would have addressed this issue in a way that maybe wouldn't have solved it, but certainly wouldn't be forcing us down the catastrophe that we are facing right now.
So, yeah, I guess the only question is, can we do it at the same time? Because I agree, it has to be to be solved in order to solve climate.
I'm going to go to the internet I hope I'm not being offensive to this person, for a kind of a straw man tweet here from M. Abram SPS and retweeted by Samra T.D. Patel. A strong economy has made the U.S. powerful, so isn't it beneficial that economy-driving companies advocate for their needs?
Wow.
That's such a common opinion, I thought I'd put it out there, you know.
Well, when their needs coincides with the needs of the citizens, then great. We should all be advocating for those needs. But when they diverge, as they have, I would say, more and more over the last few decades, then absolutely not. That's not what a democracy is about.
So Martin's not on Twitter. Let me give the Twitter answer. No.
Good. Thank you. Please.
Hi, Craig Lee Burkett. I'm just wondering if the panelists could comment on two topics. One, instant runoff voting as a possible better or not alternative to winner takes all. And the other is the future, if any, of the Electoral College at the federal level.
Let me add to that, to the Henderson Law comment online. How would you suggest we address electoral hurdles such as gerrymandering and first past the post? So overlaps halfway with that one.
Yeah, I do think that these sorts of electoral reforms can play an important part, and that the sort of two-party system that we have is one of the contributing factors to the lack of choice that I was alluding to in my talk and that we've kind of all been discussing. And exactly which form which kind of reform would be most effective, I think, is tricky. There's sort of pluses and minuses. We do see states experimenting sort of gently with alternatives, such as open primaries in California recently and so on. And, there's some evidence that there may be some beneficial effects, increasing competitiveness, which in parts of my work that I haven't talked about is one of the factors that can, at least to a degree, sort of broaden the responsiveness of policymakers to the public. So I do think that these kinds of reforms that might make elections more competitive and open them to a broader range of candidates is one of the things that we ought to be pursuing.
Yeah, and I agree with that, but again, I want to emphasize the sequence. So if tomorrow we fix the gerrymandering problem and increase the number of competitive House seats from 15% to 50%, and we eliminated the Electoral College and created a country where the presidents didn't run in 10 states but ran in 50 states or 40 states, those two changes would radically increase the cost of campaigns. And if you don't fix the way we fund campaigns, what you will have done is increase the power of the tiny fraction of the 1% who are funding campaigns. So in my view, if we fix the way we fund campaigns, then these other changes are just unambiguously good changes, but without fixing the way we fund campaigns, they can raise more problems by giving more power to these funders.
Fair enough. Thank you.
Thank you.
In the vein of election reform, I think you are correct to identify and focus on the first part of the election process, which is the funding and generation of money. There is, however, a second part of the process, which you mentioned in your talks, and that is the spending part or the consumption part of the process. And I'm wondering to what extent you've considered reforms in the consumption part of the process, specifically what candidates are spending money on, which is to try to win the election. And since it turns out that our one voter, one vote policy means that a slate of candidates has to scramble against every other candidate to try to get their vote cast, to get your vote cast for them. And our psychology as humans is such that it's easier to tarnish somebody else than to study and burnish your own ideas and present your best foot forward. My question is, have you considered approval voting instead of rank voting or our current system as a better way to address the consumption side of the election process, because it will reduce the need for candidates to battle against one another with all the negative campaigning. Now instead they can come up with ideas jointly.
Do you want to explain what you have in mind?
Yeah, just approval voting. So the idea is, let's say, a slate of 5 candidates, and now instead of the candidates battling for your one vote, you can decide you're going to vote for either this one guy or this person, and then the 1 and 3, or maybe you're going to vote for 2 and 4 and 5, but not the first one. And the idea is each candidate is now running independently on their own ideas and the strength of their own ideas, which must be solid to put forward to get a vote. And the incentive to tarnish the other candidates so you may take that vote from them is now gone away.
I mean, I haven't given this enough thought to have an opinion on whether it seems like it would have the beneficial effects that you're attributing to it.
And, I mean, I haven't seen the system run, and I'd love to see it run because love to see the experiment. I can say that, before we did this super PAC, I was somebody who didn't care at all about the way money was spent. And having now been in the middle of some political campaigns, I can tell you this is the sickest, most inefficient system you can possibly design for communicating information about important matters to the public. And I would love to see innovation in the way in which this is done. I mean, the current system is a system of non-consensual communication. Basically, you're trying to watch the Patriots, and all of a sudden somebody's interrupting you to try to tell you who you should be voting for. And they can tell you that in 30-second chunks. Now, I defy any of you to write in 30 seconds any meaningful idea. Instead, this is kind of the pornography of writing. It's, what can you say that just gets people's attention and shocks them, kind of gets them to grunt in one direction or another. And when you think about, running a democracy and getting people to think about serious issues, it is absurd that this is the way we communicate. And beginning to think about ways we could flip that around so it was consensual communication, where people were, had a reason, an incentive to actually listen to not 30 seconds, but maybe 5 minutes or 10 minutes. That would be extraordinary, I think, is the biggest challenge here, because this system doesn't work. It does not communicate. It does not give us the ability to actually move the debate along. And especially for this issue, I can tell you, where you've got to get the average voter to focus on 2 or 3 steps to get them to see, they care about climate change, you need money to be fixed. They care about health care, you need money. You need unemployment, you need money. Those complicated arguments are almost impossible to make effectively in this context. And so, absolutely, I want to figure out how to fix spending too.
And I guess the thing I would add is that, while I don't have an opinion on this particular proposed fix, that there is a hunger for real information and for you look at the number of people who watch, say, presidential debates, it's really quite astonishing. The millions and millions of Americans who will tune in to, it's not necessarily a great level of political discourse, but it's certainly a lot better than what you get from television advertising. And so I think the opportunities are there. The public, in this case, cannot be blamed for the failures of campaign communication.
Well, I can say we have rank voting in Cambridge, and I was surprised that despite the many faults of Cambridge voting, that it was congenial and had many of the effects of what you're talking about with approval voting, which would be one step better.
But you're still battling for that #1 vote. And instead, I want to remove the battle completely and present
Understood.
candidates independently.
Sounds innovative, and
Thank you.
Yeah, that would be cool. Thanks. Okay, let's go online where Bill Wendell at Real Estate Cafe says to please ask the speakers if they'd like to see any ideas for the Hack for Democracy this weekend, wish list or priorities. That's something that's going on all weekend, and the organizers of this are doing a little hackathon, design and development for good. Solve the problem in one weekend, go.
Well, I have some inside information about what's going to happen, and I'm excited about what I know is going to happen. So one of the projects is going to be thinking about a way to flip this non-consensual communication to consensual communication as a way to spread information. So they've got a project, a model for how they could do this, and they're going to build a test of that, and we're going to test it in the field to see whether, in fact, we can get a more meaningful connection to voters at a lower cost, but effectively help them understand the issues more powerfully.
And I'll kind of dodge the question by saying that, just as Larry was saying a few minutes ago, how we need not one organization but a multitude of organizations, I'll return to the point that I made, that we need to work not only on one dimension of the problem but on multiple dimensions, and that these are things that will reinforce each other. And I don't want to say, like, which child I love the best.
Hi. I was wondering, beyond the current court retiring or dying, do you envision a pathway to the courts changing their perspective in such a fundamental way, in the same way they did with Plessy versus Ferguson?
Yes, I do. And I think this is a really important point to keep in the center of the conversation about the strategy for this progressive movement. because the reality is the Supreme Court does not hang out there for long. It's way off right now, the attitudes of ordinary Americans. More than 80% of Americans believe the Citizens United decision was crazy when it was decided. That wasn't partisan. It was like 70-something of Republicans and more than 80% of Democrats, an independent standing right in the middle. And this court is not insensitive to that. Now, the question is, how do they get back? And this is a little bit law geeky, but let me be a little bit law geeky for a minute. Everybody's angry about Citizens United, and there's a good reason to be angry about Citizens United, but not because of what Citizens United did directly. What Citizens United did directly was to say corporations could spend whatever money they wanted and unions could spend whatever money they wanted. But very quickly, corporations discovered the high cost of free speech, because corporations like Target endorsed a governor candidate in Minnesota who was anti-gay, and all of a sudden found their Target stores picketed around the country. So corporations quickly kind of are becoming shy about spending their money directly. The really important innovation was the super PAC, which the Supreme Court didn't create. It was a lower court that said, if you can spend unlimited amounts of money, you should be allowed to contribute unlimited amounts of money. But that doesn't follow. And my prediction is that when the court gets around to reviewing that question, largely because I think the court sees the mess they have created, they're going to find a way to say, actually, even if you can spend whatever you have, there's no reason you should be allowed to give whatever you want to a different group. That's a corrupting process. And so then we will have, some rich people, some corporations spending money according to the court, but the big jump that we saw after Citizens United caused by this decision in the lower court will be eliminated. And I think the court will do that. Now, the reason I think that's important for the progressive movement is, I believe it's really critical we build a movement to reclaim our democracy, not just on this one dimension, as Martin was saying, but on many. And the worst thing in the world would be for us to focus our movement on a thing which the court could fix if one justice changes his or her mind. Because when that happens, we'll say, oops, we did it, we can go home. But the day Supreme Court decided Citizens United, I'll admit, they shot the body. But the body of our democracy was already cold at that moment. The Supreme Court made it worse, but it's not like it was any heaven at the time at which they intervened to make it worse. And what we need is a movement that's going to address the more fundamental problems than those caused by the Supreme Court. So that's why I firmly agree with the work that Represent.us has been doing, what Every Voice has been doing, that we've been doing with Root Strikers, to not just talk about fixing the mistakes of the Supreme Court, but also to talk about changing the way elections are funded and addressing all the other democratic problems that this democracy has, so that when we win, as opposed to convincing one justice, hey, you guys got it wrong in Citizens United.
So my question is that, is tweetism, you call it tweetism, is that necessarily a bad thing? Because Madison in Federalist 10, he called it refinement, right? He called it a process in which, the average citizen isn't necessarily super informed about every issue that comes before Congress. So that's why you have experts, that's why you have, interest groups. So is this tweetism, this first round, necessarily a bad thing? Because what this allows for is people that are have greater expertise in their field to also be doing the voting.
You're not course 15, are you?
No.
Okay.
So it's a really great question. Because I think what's interesting about looking at it like this is that you can begin to decide which kind of filters are good and which kind of filters are bad. So for example, think of Hong Kong. In my view, if you randomly selected 1,200 people in Hong Kong and you got them together in a room like this and you said to them, okay, you guys have got to figure out who the candidates should be that get to run in the general election, if it were truly randomly selected, representative, I'm not sure I'd have much of a problem with that. So the problem isn't necessarily that it's a small number. The problem is, what is the reason you are excluding people? Now, I think we all have the clear intuition that if you exclude people on the basis of race, there's something wrong with that. But the interesting fact is the framers of our Constitution wouldn't have had any problem with that. You know, they didn't care much about racial equality or sex equality. But what they did care about was income, wealth. Because when Madison said we would create a House of Representatives that would be, quote, dependent on the people alone, not the people and the funders, but the people alone, he then went on 5 Federalist Papers later to define the people. And what he said was, by the people, he means not the rich more than the poor. But we've built a filtering system that excludes the poor, not just the poor, the middle income. I mean, most people, all the way up to about $150,000 a year, are excluded from that. So this is a filter that is not justifiable from a conception of who we are as a people, even if you could think of other filters that would be justifiable. And what's striking is the one dimension of equality they cared about, we've forgotten. And the dimensions of equality they didn't care about, sex and race, we now put at the center of our system. I think we need to have all those dimensions of equality. A system that filtered on the basis of race, a system that filtered on the basis of sex, a system that filters on the basis of wealth would all be unjust Tweed-isms, even if you could describe one that wouldn't be unjust.
Thank you. So thank you to everyone who came. To close, I'll pose a question from the internet as a question to all of you about your 30-second challenge. A.M. Friedman asks, what's this movement's ice bucket challenge? And that's a good thing to reflect on as we try to grow the movement. I think Danny will say a few words, and then we will be through for the evening and on to the Hack for Democracy. No, it's just me. Okay, thank you all. A round of applause for our speakers, and have a great evening.
All right, guys.